has been a real pleasure for me to be with you this week. To get to meet brothers and sisters in different places is one of the real joys of being able to do seminars across the country. I do enjoy preaching the gospel more and to be thrilled by the truths of His Word and built up, edified. But there are times when we must do battle. That's not as pleasant, but it is certainly necessary. And I'll admit that I do enjoy embarrassing the evolutionists. My wife thinks maybe a little too much sometimes, but we are having fun. We want to talk to you tonight about perhaps the most critical subject. As I mentioned earlier, if we're doing a debate, this is the subject that I choose and that I will affirm, that the fossils are much more compatible with the idea of creation than evolution. And I think as we proceed, you'll see why. There's some of the things we look at, you see, well, they haven't seen it. And if it's not from their books, sometimes they deny. But when you use their ammunition, the statements from their leading authorities, they really have no response. And when you see what they acknowledge to be true, the battle should be over. Many Christians are intimidated by the fossil record, and we're told that they prove evolution. And if there is proof of evolution, this would have to be where it's at. This is the most critical evidence. But when we see what the truth is about the fossils, we see it's not supporting evolution at all. It speaks plainly and eloquently about sudden complex beginning. Notice the statement made by S.M. Stanley Johns Hopkins, quoted earlier, one of the perhaps the foremost paleontologist in the country, one who studies the fossils. He says the fossil record, and only the fossil record, provides direct evidence of major sequential changes. If something changed through time, this is where it would have to be proved. He says, continuing, it's doubtful whether in the absence of fossils, the idea of evolution would represent anything more than an outrageous hypothesis. And I hope you remember that statement by the time we get to the end tonight. And this is the conclusion if they don't have evidence from the fossils, which I think is the case, and I think we'll be able to show. Now, how do we look at dead things in rocks and tell whether it supports creation or evolution better? One of the ways we proceed in science is to make predictions. If your idea is true, then you ought to be able to see this. Or if this is true, you ought to be able to see that. And those predictions help us evaluate the models. When we're looking at the contrasting predictions of the two models, it's just black and white. I mean, it's just opposite. The evolutionist predicts that simple beginning, gradually progressing upward, whereas the creationist says, no, it all started at once and maybe has gone downhill since then. Now, that's different. And we ought to be able to look at the fossil record and tell which one is served best by the evidence, especially when we look at the beginning. The beginning, as illustrated in the diagram, yeah, that's different, and we should be able to see that. There should be a simple, gradual, linked progression, if evolution is true, as opposed to the complex, abrupt, diverse beginning, if creation is true, especially if we're looking at flood crossing, which I think is the best explanation for the fossils. There should be the allied continuum of progression upward, On the other hand, the creationist says, no, it's distinct and separate. Stasis is the fancy word, Latin word means staying the same. We get status quo from it. Stasis is opposite to evolution. Separate, distinct, is different from this progressive continuum. So, let's look at the record, see which one we seek. There's another factor that I think we should see as a contrast. Both do predict similarities, but for different reasons, and would leave a different pattern in the fossil record. The branching pattern is what we would see explaining similarities if evolution is true. We would expect similarities, creator creating similar forms for similar functions, but not this branching progressive pattern, just like the artist would put a blue tile here where it needs it, and a blue tile there. It's similar from a common designer, but different forms for different functions, similar forms for similar functions. So yes, similarities both, but a different pattern. Now, I can tell you that the fossil record fits creation a whole lot better, but that's not going to impress a lot of evolutionists. So we're going to use the description from the evolutionists themselves, from what's called antagonistic witnesses. These are devout believers, but they're believers in evolution. All of these quotations are from men of great faith in evolution. And that really provides even stronger evidence. You're in court, you got somebody testifies for you that's a friend. Okay, well, they expect that. That helps, but that's not powerful evidence. If you get the enemy, contrary to his best interest, to acknowledge the truth that favors your position, that's much stronger evidence. That's judicially 10 times as great. So we're going to use the statements from the evolutionists so we don't misunderstand or misrepresent. I'm not saying they agree, they disagree, but here are facts that they acknowledge to be true. And when you look squarely at those facts, we can see how they add up. We'll begin with Richard Dawkins, the hope of evolution that we've quoted from several times. He's certainly not going to exaggerate his problems or acknowledge our views, what we predict easily. But the critical part of the fossil record would be the beginning part. What does he say about it? We find many of them already in an advanced state of evolution the very first time they appear. Now that's an amazing statement. How do you know it's a state of evolution if, boom, there they are and they're already advanced when they first appeared? That's not a picture of evolution. It is as though they were just planted there without any evolutionary history. There's no evolutionary history. They're abrupt and complete when they start, but that's a state of evolution. I think you see his prejudice showing obviously, but the facts are, boom, there they are. No history. They are in an advanced state to start with. It's pictured, well, it goes on, let me back that up. Needless to say, this appearance of sudden planting has delighted the creationists. Yep, I'll plead guilty. That's exactly what we predict. And that's another way of saying it meets the creationist predictions, doesn't meet ours. The picture of that beginning is acknowledged by National Geographic, which is no friend to the creationists. The Cambrian is that bottom layer in the geologic column, and there we have slow, gradual beginning. No, we have an explosion of life. And notice the description from Stephen Gould, perhaps certainly one of the most representative paleontologists, fossil experts in the world, recently deceased. The Cambrian explosion occurred in a geological moment. All the major anatomical designs, we caught him using the word he doesn't really mean, but that's what it looks like when it slipped out. All the major anatomical designs may have made their evolutionary appearance at that time. Boom, there it is, but that's an evolutionary appearance. Prejudice is obviously coloring his conclusions, but boom, it starts, and all of the designs are there. Not only the phylum Chordata, that's animals with backbones, that's at the top of their evolutionary progression. And not only that major biological division, the phylum itself, but all of its major divisions. Where? Right at the start, as an explosion at the bottom of that geologic column. Contrary to Darwin's expectations, or you could say predictions, just the opposite of what they predict is what they acknowledge we see. Now, if I were writing that and trying to make it up to fit our view, I don't think I could have done a better job. But I didn't do that. That is one of the leading experts in the world of evolutionists. Since the so-called, it gets worse for them, since the so-called Cambrian, that's the bottom layer, explosion, no new phyla of animals have entered the fossil layer. Nothing, then boom, everything, and then nothing since then. What does that look like to you? Is it difficult to see which model is served best with the evidence? Michael Maltz of the University of Texas is rather unguarded in his acknowledgement, quoted here by MSNBC. The Cambrian explosion, it wasn't a gradual development of complexity. Now that's what they expect at the bottom. It wasn't, he said. It's as if these things suddenly seem to burst out of a magic box. Again, if I were trying to make this up, I couldn't have done better. Was not what they expect. It was exactly what we expect. The predictions are very much in contrast, and I think they tell the difference. More recent, your quotation, evolutionary biology. The fossils from the Cambrian period can cause a real headache for evolutionary biologists. In other words, they don't fit what they expect. Reason for the headache. They expect simple organisms evolving over time to become increasingly more complex. That's the prediction. However, during the Cambrian period, there was an apparent explosion of different major groups of animals, all appearing one at a time, gradually, simultaneously. Boom, there they are, all of them. None since then. It's like, now we can go home. That's just, I think, critical. Summarizing their statements, the beginning, as if they burst out of a magic box. They're complex suddenly right at the start. A real headache for evolutionary biologists. Advanced as if they're just planted without any evolutionary history. All the major anatomical designs, Chordata, all of its major divisions, and since then, no new phyla. Now, that's just not a contest. And this is not my description. This is from the evolutionists themselves, and in the handout you have the documentation and where to find that and verify it. That's their description of the most critical part, the beginning. But when you look in the biology textbooks, this is the picture of the evolution of life that they teach. in spite of the fossils, this is the picture. And it's not the fossils, as Google acknowledges. He says the evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of the fossil. In fact, if you were to turn that upside down, it would be closer to what you see in the fossil record, with the chordata, everything right at the beginning. I think it's gone downhill. Conservationists are telling us we're losing at least 2 species a month. That's not uphill, is it? But this is what we see. That's what they predict. And that's what they put in the books, not the evidence of the fossil. And if you see something like that, you just know that the fossils say the opposite of that. Understand that is in spite of the fossils. Well, where does it come from? Let them describe the beginning. We have arranged the groups in a traditional way. This is a textbook that I was taught from at 2 different state universities. We've arranged these groups in the traditional way, simplest forms first, progressively more complex groups follow. We've arranged them that way. Not because of the fossils. Now, to be fair, we go on with another statement in the rest of here on this same page that modifies that somewhat. And he says, well, we just arranged it. There is a fundamental reason they've arranged it this way. There is logic to it, not fossils. They're alike because they're related. Now, that fundamental assumption allows them to look at the fossils and see evolution, because they arrange it based on similarities. As we'll see, they're very selective in their similarities. They ignore many and pick out the ones that work. But the less they look alike, the further removed they are from the common ancestor, is the fundamental assumption. Now, we look at animals in the fossil record and around us, and we see similarities that you can't really deny that there's a similarity there. We won't get personal, but we can look around the room and we can see some similarities here, can't we? They don't ask the question why. They begin with the assumption it's because they're related. We ask the question why, and there are other explanations for similarity. You drive down a subdivision, you see houses that are similar, and it's because they're all cousins, right? No, they have not common genetics, they have a common designer, and that explains just as well. And so when we see similarity that is demonstrated in the textbooks called homology, the similarity of forms, here's the vertebrate hand, the pendactyl form, 5 fingers, the general architecture is similar. Why? Again, they don't ask. But it could be common designer or it could be common genetics. But as we look closer and ask that question and evaluate and compare the 2 explanations, one explains as well as the other, we see a miserable failure on the part of the idea that it's common genetics, because you look closely at the genetics and the genetics are different. For example, that pendactyl form, the hand, comes from totally different parts of the embryo. The newt hand comes from 2 through 5, lizard 6 through 9, man 13 through 18, which says, no, they didn't develop from common genetics. Round up looking similar, because that's what the designer wanted it, similar forms for similar functions, but they did not come from common genetics. They came from contrasting genetics. That doesn't work. Notice the comment by the director of the British Museum of Natural History, Sir Gavin De Vere, professor of embryology at Oxford. I think most would acknowledge that he's probably the leading embryologist in the world. He says the attempt to find homologous genes, homology is the the similarity has been given up as hopeless. Homologous forms, I think, because of common designer, but common genetics doesn't work, as he acknowledges. But we still see this representation because they assume that it's based on similarity and they arrange it, still, as we'll see, skewing the picture by picking out selectively which similarities to choose, and then misrepresenting some of the data. For example, you've probably heard that man and the chimpanzee, very similar. Richard Dawkins made this claim 37 years ago. Chimpanzees and we share more than 99% of the genes. I think that's a very outdated picture for reasons we'll demonstrate. It's just really not true, we've learned. Science here is not, and this is the journal that represents the American Association for the Advancement of Science, a leading journal in the U.S. Under the heading Relative Differences, the myth of 1%. Chunks of missing DNA, extra genes, the very structure of chromosomes confound any quantification of humanness versus chimpness. 1%, 2%, 100%. It's just so different that you can't even say what the percentage would be because it's just different. Nature, here in 2010, elaborates on that, pointing out the comparison now reveals they differ radically in sequence structure, gene content. The chimpanzee genome is 10 to 15% longer. Does that sound like there's 1% difference? Some would say 2. No. 50% of the human genes are missing from the chimp. But wait a minute. It's supposed to be 2% difference or what? That's just not so. 1/3 more gene categories and entirely different classes of genes from perhaps the leading scientific journal in the world, Nature, says that claim is just, that technical word we talked about from Arkansas, that's just hogwash. Not so. But you have it in your textbooks, and you probably heard your teachers telling you that. Bill Nye, the science guy, just automatically affirmed that when he was debating in House. Some of you may have seen. One of the arguments that has been made in the past, not always made today, but illustrates the thinking that we do see made over and over again. We look at the number of chromosomes and we see a sequence, penicillium, very similar, or very simple organism, 2 chromosomes. Housefly 12, alligator 32, human 46. Okay, there's your progression. And that you can picture if you ignore the rest of the evidence. When you look at all of the evidence, which is necessary for good science, you see a very different picture. The fern has 480. The turkey's got twice as many as we do, 82. The human down 46. The chimp's got more than we do. The rest of the evidence says this first argument is very deceitful, doesn't it? They have selected which similarities they want you to look at. And that's the basis of that tree. The ones they have picked out now look like evolution because they picked them out, ignoring the rest of the evidence. When you're talking about fossils, similarity is where it's at. This is how you see that dead grains in rock mean something. So you look at all of the evidence and you see similarities, but sometimes the similarities don't mean what they say. These 2 fish look similar, right? See some heads nodding, and you nodded your head, I caught you. But neither of these are fish. One is a reptile and one is a mammal, porpoise, ichthyosaur. They're not related at all, but they're similar. So, similarity indicates common ancestry, except when it doesn't. And it doesn't a lot of the time. Let's illustrate that. Considering what is similar to what we see in man, there are some obvious and rather dramatic similarities. Blood serum is dramatically similar. In fact, with the right antiserum, you can actually utilize chimpanzee blood serum. Very similar. But that's not the whole picture. What about milk chemistry? No. Apes have very different blood milk chemistry. One has the closest similarity. Well, one of the closest is the donkey. And some might say, yeah, I know some people that might fit. But no, that's not the picture. It's supposed to be from the apes. And there is something even more similar than the donkey. And I'll guarantee you would never guess it. Not the ape, not anything close to the ape. It's the cockroach. Notice from Science News, here's roach milk could be a new superfood. Cockroach milk is among the most nutritious substances on earth. It's 3 times richer in calories than buffalo milk, previous top considered. That's what y'all thought was closer to RGG. No. That doesn't fit the evolution picture, does it? Not, I mean, it just makes fun of it, actually. When you look at cholesterol, we're concerned about that. There are animals that have problems as well, but the one that has cholesterol closest to us is the garter snake. Yeah, maybe some people might fit that picture, but that's not the picture that you see in the textbooks. Teeth are significant when we're digging and trying to find bones, and they're very resistant to decay and very important, useful, lots of good information. Who has the closest teeth to the human? The fish, not the ape. Now, some of you might be envious here, but this fish has some pretty good chompers and looks a whole lot like ours, not like the ape that has teeth, but not like our teeth. But the sheep's head, sheep, wow, look at those teeth. That's not a similarity that they would describe in the textbook. It's guarantee you won't see it there. Foot structure we're concerned about when we're looking at the footprints down at Melrose, and some say, well, maybe an ape made that. Which wouldn't help the picture of evolution because they evolved up with us according to them. But you look at the ape's foot and there's no mistaking that. He's got a hand for a foot. And that's very distinguishable. However, the glacial bear has a foot very dramatically similar to ours. It's a quadruped and he has claws. But when you remove the claws and look at that foot structure underneath, you almost can't tell the difference between the bone structure of the bear and the human. Very simple, but not what you see in the textbooks. Tear enzyme, chicken has tear enzyme just like we do. We need it. It's like little Pac-Man that go around eating bacteria. Need it in our eyes. Chicken needs it when it's laying the egg to fight bacteria there. Blue tile here, blue tile there, where the designer put it. Very similar. And for some reason, the nematode needs exactly the same complex chemical, the lysosome, which is the tear enzyme. What does he do? I don't know what he does, but it's certainly not what the evolutionists would predict in terms of similarity to humans. Blood antigen A, our closest relative is the bird. And brain hormone. Okay, there is a brain hormone among the critters that God created, just like ours. You're not going to believe it. It's the cockroach again, who has brain hormone just like ours. Notice from Discover, don't squash that roach. He may be your cousin. The cockroach and man share not a similar, a common brain hormone. Luteal here, luteal. That's the way the designer does it, but not the ape, the cockroach. And so when we look at similarities, which I love to look at, but look at the whole picture, we're not looking at that branching pattern where it's connected, where it's supposed to be connected. Again, similarity indicates common ancestry, except when it doesn't. And it doesn't a lot of the time. What we're looking at is that mosaic pattern that would look like the designer rather than the branching pattern that the evolutionist predicts. And so when we look at the evidence, the beginning, the trees, the similarities, any way you want to look at it, we see dramatic favor for the creation position. I don't think there's much of a way to miss that. If we're going to see evolution, we really need transitional forms to show this one led to this one, led to this one. If we don't see that, then how can you say it's proved? That's the only way you could prove it. But that's not what Darwin saw, and he saw that as a problem. Innumerable transitional forms must have existed. And this one gradually led to this one, and this one gradually led to that one, and that's what was going on throughout life. And the fossil record preserves that. Then, yeah, there ought to be transitional forms everywhere. But why do we not find them embedded in countless numbers in the crust of the earth? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such graduated organic chain. And this, perhaps, is the greatest objection which can be urged against my theory. Now, he didn't look at the fossil record and say, see evolution. He says, this is the biggest problem I've got, the fossil record, because it does not show what ought to be there. That's his, he says, the greatest objection to his view. But he says he solves that problem with his imagination. In time, as you collect more, he says you'll be able to fill in these gaps and you'll be able to find these progressions. Well, David Rout, perhaps the leading fossil authority in the country in terms of actual fossils, curated the Chicago Field Museum of Natural History, largest fossil museum in the United States. Comments on that. He said it's a bigger problem now than it was in Darwin's day. He was embarrassed by the fossil record because it didn't look the way he predicted it, as we saw from his quote. It was an embarrassment. Well, we're now 120 years after Darwin. Knowledge of the fossil record has been greatly expanded, and it solved the problem. Now we have 250,000 fossil species, but the situation hasn't changed much. Ironically, we have even fewer examples of evolutionary transition than we had in Darwin's day. It's gotten worse. And it was the greatest objection that could be urged against the theory in Darwin's day. By this I mean some of the classic cases of Darwinian change in the fossil record, such as the evolution of the horse in North America. You ever seen that in the fossil, in the textbooks? Have had to be discarded. And you know, this picture of the horses evolving has been discarded. You all view that? You see the blank stare. No, it's in every textbook in the country. Still there. But the leading authority says, no, that's a classic case that has to be discarded, and along with some of the others as well. We look at this kind of a picture in the textbooks. And one problem, we excavated this fossil called Ascentius gigantus just about 20 miles north of Lubbock, Texas. We have excavated this. 9 feet tall at the shoulder, a donkey. You've seen a lot of 9 foot tall donkeys. No, that's not what they look like. That kind of messes up the chart just from the start. But look carefully at the chart. We begin with the hydrocatherium, as it was called initially. 1840, English geologist Richard Boyne invented the term, which he identified as, and the hydrocatherium is a fancy Latin combination that means like a hyrax. Not like a horse, like a hyrax. Well, that's what it looks like. And you look at the fossils, and that's why it's called hydrocatherium, like a hyrax. But here in 2016 Natural History Museum at Oxford, evolutionary origin of the modern horse can be traced back to the first horse, hydrocatherium, like a hyrax, but that's what they're calling a horse. Does that look much like a horse to you? I mean, you know about horses around here in Oklahoma, and that's not looking much like a horse. I guess you could put a saddle on him, but I don't think that's very horsey looking. A lot of authorities have acknowledged that it doesn't. And here in Wikipedia, not a friend to creationists, we read hyraxes are sometimes described as being the closest living relative to the elephant. Yeah, I see that. Or do you? Maybe you can imagine that, but he doesn't look much like an elephant to me, or a horse. He looks like a hyrax, which is what Richard Owen said. Although whether this is so or not is disputed. Well, bless their heart. So you look at that first example, elephant, horse, maybe. It doesn't look like either. It looks like a hyrax. The rest of them are variations on a theme. You see all kinds of horses, big ones and little ones, different breeds that look very different. But all of these, the 4 and one more species, are found in one spot in the fossil record, the Ashfall fossil beds. This is Antelope County, Nebraska. A volcanic ash covered and killed a lot of animals that are there together, and all 5 of these fossil horses are side by side, died all at one time with one volcanic explosion. This is not an illustration of different things that evolved over time. They all were variations on the theme that lived at the same time, contemporaneously. And so when you see the first one, wasn't a horse, and the others were horses that just varied and were all living together, yeah, you have to discard that, which is why David Rapp said, yeah, that has to be discarded. It's a classic case, it's gone. Archaeopteryx is one that is a transitional form, supposed to be the perfect transitional form in all of the textbooks. It's half lizard and half bird, and this led to the birds. And he was mostly lizard and just became a bird. You can see it happening. Well, you've got really good fossils. You've got beautiful preservation of the feathers. And out on the edge of the wing, of this perfect bird wing, you've got claws. Well, see, that means he's primitive. Well, we do have some birds that have claws. Most of them have lost the claws. Is that uphill or downhill? They lost something that was an advantage that Hoatzin, which is a modern bird down in South America, has claws on its wings, just like Archaeopteryx. It's modern, and it's a perfect bird. But the real knockout punch came from paleontologists out near Lubbock, where we just were a few months ago. I worked with Chatterjee several times. he found a bird that was half again as old as Archaeopteryx. In other words, Archaeopteryx wasn't leading the birds got there before Archaeopteryx did. Fossil remains of two crow-sized birds, 75 million years older than Archaeopteryx. This is down below, and then you get to Archaeopteryx, which was supposed to lead to the birds, but the birds were already there. Chatterjee says he's curator of paleontology at the Museum, Texas Tech. And by the way, we just turned around the one who is now the curator, who succeeded in that, about three weeks ago. These fossils have advanced avian or bird features. They're good birds before Archaeopteryx, and so how can Archaeopteryx lead to the birds? Just blew it out of the water. And when you look at the supposed links, I debated a paleontologist at Lamar University in Texas. He said every fossil is a transitional form. He held up a book of all the fossils, and he says, everyone, well, of course, if you believe in evolution and you have great faith, then, yeah, that's the way they got there. But trying to show something that leads to something else, Darwin said you can't do that. And when you look at the few examples he thought you could show, they have been discarded, and it's worse now than it was in his time. Here's a fossil that made headlines just recently, and this is pretty much what they would need to show in order to show evolution. Here's a four-legged whale. He started out on land and he was a mammal and led to the whales, okay. And they got all excited about that. You see it in all of the news reporting. Here's NPR, scientists discovered a fossil of a four-legged whale. Okay. Newsweek says scientists have found the fossil of a deadly four-legged whale. Okay, remember that. Deadly four-legged whale. New York Post, fossil of previously unknown four-legged whale found. BBC, new species of ancient four-legged whale. Now, this is something, I mean, they're desperate to find something. And okay, here we got it. Finally, four-legged whale. Well, let's look at that four-legged whale. There he is. That's him in all of his glory. That's all they found. Now, when it was written up in the technical papers, it was like this. The black, of course, white is speculation. The red is all they found. You take away the speculation, and there's your deadly four-legged whale. Where's the legs? No legs anywhere. Flippers? I don't know. Who knows? Related to whales, how would you tell? That may have nothing to do. All you've got is this, which they can then draw to fit into the picture, but the picture is, it's ridiculous once you see what they're actually working with. Four legs, no legs at all. What it illustrates is they're desperate. Why would they use this when they got better? Well, if they had better, they would use it. But this is the best they've got. That's why Stephen Stanley, more honestly, says, in fact, fossil record does not convincingly document a single transition of one species to another. And there's hardly a higher authority anywhere than Stephen Stanley. I think we can summarize the picture with statements here from Stephen Gould. He wrote for 30 years a natural history article every month, promoting evolution in every article. And he's talking about fossil transitions in his the tome, the big book that he wrote just before he passed away. This was published in 2002. He died, I believe, the next year. But the main theme that he says is illustrated in the fossil record that is documented in this huge book. Makes a good doorstop. But a lot of detailed work is stasis. That's staying the same. Looking at Wikipedia's definition of that term, little or no evolutionary change in species. That's what stasis means. You got one fossil at the end and another fossil at the beginning, and spread over several years, no net change, with beginning and end points substantially the same. This is the definition of stasis. Stasis existed, he says in this text, in overwhelming abundance, as every paleontologist needs. Most common pattern in the fossil record. The primary signal of the fossil record. Darwin's expectations defined evolution as gradual change. In this context, stasis can only record sorrow and disappointment. That's not the way the creationists look at it, but that's the way the evolutionists look at it. It's an empirical signal of quite stunning contrariness. Sound like somebody who says this fits our prediction. Empirical falsification. Now, those are strong words that say, it does not say evolution, it says the opposite, it says stasis. Well, that was from a paleontologist that's now passed away. His dying work, you might say, published just before he died. I think Donald Prothero probably would be the heir to the throne of the leading geologist today. He's from Caltech, author of 5 geology textbooks. And so if you're studying undergraduate geology, almost always you'll be using his textbooks. Here's what he says. This was 2015. Many paleontologists came forward and pointed out that the geologic literature was one vast monument to stasis. And that's what Google said, with relatively few cases where anyone observed gradual evolution. So we got a monument, it's not to evolution, it's to stasis. Many paleontologists all over the world saw that stasis was the general pattern. That's the case 2002 when Google wrote his book, published his book. That is still the consensus. Well, he said it much later than 40 years, but he said it first 40 years ago. And now then it's still the consensus of the scientists, of the geologists today. The general pattern is stasis. And so when you summarize the evidence from the evolutionists, it was Darwin's biggest problem then, that is transitions. It's worse now. It embarrassed him, and his best examples were debunked. It's a headache for the evolutionary biologist. It delights, on the other hand, the creationists. It's like they're just planted, advanced. There's an explosion of all of the major forms, like it came out of a magic box. The similarities are mosaic, not branching, and it is overall a monument to stasis. Now, which model works best? Which predictions fit? If you don't have fossils, and from this acknowledgement by the evolutionists themselves, they don't have a fossil, you remember the conclusion. It's just an outrageous hypothesis, according to Stephen Stanley. I think that's absolutely true, and the fossil record is ours. I would love to talk about the fossils. That's what I want to debate, and I think we can take their evidence as they acknowledge it and just hammer the daylights out. They're dead in the water. They have no evidence. It is an outrageous hypothesis according to their evaluation. Without the fossils, They don't have it. We do. We don't need to be intimidated by the fossils that belong to us. I think that primary evidence of a global flood, as we pointed out last night, you see the horizontal layers full of dead things. That's what you predict as a creationist. If you listen to the evidence that we talked about this week, surely you understand it's on our side. And there is every reason to believe the book that describes that beginning, that also describes the end that's coming. And it won't be very long. Not millions of years. If there are no millions of years, and the creation was not that long ago, when the book that describes it says it's coming, the great day is coming, then it just might be Thursday. It might be Friday. And you need to make sure that you're ready. If you're here this evening and haven't rendered obedience to the gospel, we want to encourage you to do that while we stand and sing.